And so this is just a pictorial representation. For those of you who like pictures of what we're looking at here, we're really asking whether emotion regulation difficulties might mediate the link between attachment security and parenting with social anxiety, considering also that behavioral inhibition is also likely to be influential here. And so in what's been our first look at this question, we've sort of done this trying to look at all three of these aspects of emotion regulation in terms of monitoring, evaluation, and modification of emotion. So for example, for monitoring, we have both reports from both the child and the mother about how aware does the child seem to be of their emotional states. For evaluation, we have in emotionally charged situations, what kinds of attributions do children make? Do they tend to make negative self-attributions? And in terms of modification, we have a maternal report of coping. What does your child do when they're distressed? And I can tell you that all three of these are related to social anxiety. So children who are socially anxious have poor awareness of their emotions, more prone to making negative self-evaluations in emotionally charged situations, and their mothers report that they use less constructive coping. And in all of these analyses, I'm just trying to kind of simplify little things. We've used a general index of constructive coping, but I can tell you that that effect is primarily pulled by a scale having to do with problem solving, so that children who are highly socially anxious do not use problem solving to cope with their problems. So social anxiety is related to the monitoring, evaluation and strategies for modifying emotions. And this adds to what's a really small literature that's looked at this question. It might surprise you if you're not doing work in this area. There's actually surprisingly few studies looking at the emotion regulation skills of anxious children. And we then ran a series of regressions in which we were sort of wanting to know, okay, emotion regulation, if it's the mediator, what happens to the link between parenting and social anxiety if you control for emotion regulation? Again, the logic, right? Control for the mediator, control for some variable. If it's the mediator, it should diminish the association between parent-child relationships and anxiety. So this is just a simple way to show that to you, that when you, as a block, enter all of those emotion regulation variables together to predict social anxiety, and then you add in the parenting variables, they don't explain additional variance, suggesting, consistent with sort of a mediation idea that the emotion regulation competencies are mediating those links. Now you might be saying, what's that 0.07 on that slide? That's that was the R-squared change from the previous analysis when we didn't have emotion regulation in, just so you can see the difference in the size of the R-squared change when emotion regulation is or is not in the regression equation. And you can see that for attachment, it's a similar picture. Attachment is not related to anxiety once you control for these emotion regulation processes. So just to summarize what I showed you then. So we've got some evidence here that social anxiety is related to emotion regulation difficulties in children. These children who are more socially anxious, being less aware of their emotions, again, how they evaluate themselves more negatively, and they use less constructive kinds of ways of coping with problems. And some initial evidence that emotion regulation processes may mediate the link between parent-child relationships and social anxiety. So this, of course, leads to new questions. And one of them is, which I'm going to return to at the very end when I talk about the model. I'm not going to talk about any data on this question. But it leads to the question of then, well, what might be some of the other things to look at as potential mediators? So I certainly wouldn't assume that emotion regulation is the only relevant mediator here. So we've heard about things over the last 2 days. So attention control, for example, might be another kind of a mechanism to look at. But in all the work that I've at least put up here now to illustrate for you, you probably picked up on the fact, well, gee, this is a cross-sectional study. certainly you could be concerned about whether I've told you the right causal chain here, right? There's a whole question of direction of influence. Is it, I put up those nice boxes showing parent-child relationships to emotion regulation, to anxiety, but what's to say it doesn't run the other way, right? You have an anxious child and you don't like it, you become less accepting, more controlling, etc. So I want to also show you some data from a second study that's longitudinal. And the nice thing about this longitudinal study is it really allows us to do two things. One is to ask, do parent-child relationships predict anxiety at a later point in time? So at least you get the temporal precedence problem solved, right? But even more interesting, we can ask a slightly different question having to do with whether parent-child relationships can explain changes in social anxiety over time. Can we actually predict, for example, which children are likely to become even more anxious as they get older? And do parent-child relationships predict for us which children are likely to show an increase in social anxiety? And so I've looked at this question in the context of the NICHD study of early child care, focusing specifically on assessments of anxiety and other variables that were done in the middle childhood period. And now I'm shifting away for a moment away from social anxiety specifically, because in the NICHD study, what they have are general measures of anxiety symptomatology that actually comes from parents. And these data are all based on maternal report of anxiety symptoms that I'm going to show you today. And so the question is, can parent-child relationships explain unique variants in anxiety symptoms after considering other risk factors? Kind of the question I told you before, only now you'll see we've got a whole bunch more risk factors that we can look at simultaneously. And also, can parent-child relationship explain changes in anxiety symptoms from the beginning to the end of middle childhood? So in terms of the design, as I indicated, I'm focusing, this is the NICHD study has children across the first 15 years of life. I'm focusing on data from middle childhood, roughly 5 to 12 years of age. And focusing in terms of assessing anxiety, we looked at anxiety reports from mothers that were from the beginning of middle childhood and the end of middle childhood, since I'm interested in trying to figure out if we can predict the change across middle childhood. And in terms of trying to predict anxiety, either later anxiety or increases in anxiety over time, not surprisingly, I'm interested in parent-child relationships, how attachment and parenting might predict later anxiety. But also, in the context of the NICHD data set, there are several other factors that potentially might be important for predicting anxiety. So, for example, we just heard in the previous talk about when their own mothers are anxious, children are more likely to show anxiety as well. So they have measures of maternal anxiety. Negative life events has also been linked to various kinds of internal symptomatology, behavioral inhibition, and then in a more exploratory way, I was interested in early entry to puberty, because there's been this whole discussion about whether girls who enter puberty earlier, are they at risk for a whole host of problems, including potentially internalizing symptoms, and then looked at child sex as well. So both in terms of whether girls or boys were more likely to be anxious, but also whether the predictors might be different for girls and boys. So from the larger NICHD study, I'm talking about 827 families that were studied during this middle childhood period. And in terms of measuring anxiety symptoms, again, this is all maternal report, and we had the reports from the mother that she filled out when her child was in kindergarten and first grade were aggregated to create an index of early anxiety, and the reports from 5th and 6th grade were aggregated to create an index of anxiety at the end of middle childhood. So it's those two aggregated variables that we're interested in the analyses I'll show you in a moment.